I had just moved to a new city for work, and between the relocation costs and deposit for my future apartment, my budget was stretched thin. Airbnb seemed like a reasonable solution for temporary housing. After a quick search, I found a listing that fit perfectly. A private room in a shared house hosted by someone named Karen. The photos showed a quaint house with a clean, minimalist interior. The reviews were mostly positive, praising Karen's hospitality, though a few mentioned that she could be a bit eccentric. I dismissed it. I'd met plenty of quirky people in my life. The price was right, and she responded quickly to my booking request, confirming everything within minutes. When I arrived, Karen greeted me with a warm smile. She was a petite woman in her late 40s, with wiry hair tied back in a messy bun and glasses perched on her nose. Her energy was pleasant, and she eagerly showed me around the house. "This is your room," she said, gesturing to a cozy space with a twin bed, a small desk, and a window overlooking the backyard. "Bathrooms down the hall, and feel free to use the kitchen. Oh, one thing." She paused, her expression turning serious. "Please don't open the door at the end of the hallway. That's my storage room, and I prefer to keep it private." Her tone was friendly, but her sudden shift caught me off guard. I nodded quickly. "Of course. No problem." That evening, as I settled into my room, I couldn't shake a nagging sense of unease. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen was the only sound. I convinced myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place and went to bed early. But sleep didn't come easily. The walls were thin, and I could hear Karen moving around. Her footsteps seemed to linger outside my door longer than they should. I told myself it was nothing, and eventually drifted off. The next day, while Karen was at work, I worked remotely from my room. Around noon, I ventured into the kitchen to make lunch. On the way, I passed the door. It was unremarkable, just an ordinary wooden door with a brass handle. But now that I was alone in the house, its presence felt oddly significant. I hesitated, my curiosity almost getting the better of me. But I remembered Karen's rule. Shaking off the thought, I continued to the kitchen. That evening, Karen seemed quieter than before. She was polite but distant, her responses clipped. After a brief conversation, she retreated to her room, leaving me alone in the living room. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, a soft shuffling noise, almost like fabric brushing against wood. It seemed to come from the door. I froze, straining to listen. The noise stopped. My mind raced. Was it a mouse? Maybe Karen had a cat she hadn't mentioned. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the growing unease. Over the next few nights, the noises grew louder. It wasn't just shuffling anymore. There were faint whispers, indistinct murmurs that sent chills down my spine. I considered confronting Karen, but didn't want to seem paranoid. One night, I decided to investigate. Armed with my phone flashlight, I tiptoed down the hallway. The whispers were clearer now, rhythmic and unsettling. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling. Just as I began to turn it, Karen's voice sliced through the silence. "I told you not to open that door." I whipped around to see her standing in the shadows, her face half hidden. Her tone was calm, but carried an unmistakable edge of menace. I thought I heard something," I stammered. Her lips curled into a tight smile. "It's just the wind. You should get some rest." I nodded and retreated to my room, heart pounding. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I decided to leave. As I packed, Karen knocked on my door. Her demeanor was eerily cheerful. "Leaving so soon?" she asked. "Yeah, a family emergency," I lied. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something sinister. Days later, out of morbid curiosity, I searched for Karen's address online. What I found made my blood run cold. 2 years earlier, a tenant had gone missing while staying at that very house. Her body was later discovered in a locked storage room. The main suspect, the host, a woman named Karen. I needed a break. Between work stress and personal challenges, a weekend alone in the woods seemed like the perfect escape. After browsing through Airbnb listings, I stumbled upon a cabin that looked like something out of a postcard. It was small but charming, nestled in a dense forest with a fire pit outside and a cozy interior. The host, Greg, had excellent reviews, all mentioning how peaceful and private the cabin was. I booked it without hesitation. Greg sent me all the details promptly, including instructions for using the key lockbox. "No one else will be around," he reassured me in our messages. "The place is all yours. Enjoy the quiet." I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive through the winding forest road was breathtaking, the trees towering like sentinels on either side. The cabin was just as advertised, a picturesque wooden structure with a small fortune large windows that overlooked the forest. Inside, everything was clean and orderly. I unpacked, lit a fire in the small wood stove, and prepared for a relaxing evening. While arranging my clothes, I noticed something odd: an open suitcase under the bed. It wasn't mine. I crouched down to get a better look. The suitcase was packed neatly with clothes, jeans, t-shirts, socks, all folded meticulously. Beside it were a toothbrush and a few toiletries. My first thought was that Greg had forgotten to clear out the belongings of the last guest. I texted him immediately. His reply came quickly. "Oh, that must have been left by a previous guest. Don't worry, I'll come by tomorrow to grab it. Sorry for the inconvenience." It seemed like a plausible explanation, though it left me uneasy. Why would someone forget an entire suitcase? Still, I decided to let it go. I locked the doors and settled in for the night. Around midnight, I woke up to an unusual sound, a dull thud. At first, I thought it was the creaking of the cabin settling, but then I heard it again, louder this time. It seemed to come from the living room. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone for light and crept toward the source of the noise. The living room appeared undisturbed, but when I turned my flashlight toward the coffee table, I froze. The suitcase, the same suitcase that had been under the bed, was now sitting upright in the middle of the living room. My mind reeled. I knew I hadn't moved it. For a long moment, I stood there, listening to the deafening silence of the cabin. Finally, I mustered the courage to approach it. Slowly, I pushed it back into the bedroom and slid it under the bed again. I barely slept the rest of the night, every creak and groan of the cabin sending waves of paranoia through me. The next morning, Greg texted to say he was on his way. I didn't mention the suitcase moving. I didn't want to sound insane. When he arrived, he apologized profusely for the inconvenience and insisted on helping me check the entire cabin for anything else left behind by previous guests. That's when we found the attic hatch. It was in the hallway ceiling, barely noticeable unless you looked directly up. The edges were dusty except for the latch, which looked freshly used. "Did you go up there?" Greg asked, his voice tense. I shook my head, feeling a cold pit form in my stomach. He grabbed a chair to stand on and pulled the hatch open. A rickety ladder unfolded, leading up into darkness. "Stay here," he said, climbing up cautiously. He was only up there for a few seconds before scrambling back down, his face pale. "There's a sleeping bag up there," he whispered. "And food wrappers. Someone's been staying here." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone else had been in the cabin. They could still be here. I packed my things and left immediately, with Greg promising to report it to the authorities. To this day, I don't know who was in that attic or what their intentions were. But every time I think about the suitcase moving in the middle of the night, I can't help but shudder. I had a business trip scheduled in a small, unremarkable town. Instead of booking an expensive hotel, I decided to try out an Airbnb. The listing was for a studio apartment attached to a family home. It was clean, simple, and reasonably priced. The host, Sarah, was polite and responsive, answering all my questions promptly. She mentioned that she and her husband lived in the main house and that the studio was completely private. I appreciated the arrangement. It felt safe, yet independent. I arrived late in the evening. Sarah greeted me at the door, handing me the keys with a warm smile. She seemed kind, the type of host who genuinely cared about her guests' comfort. After showing me around the studio, she wished me a pleasant stay and disappeared into the main house. The studio was perfect for my needs: a small kitchenette, a cozy bed, and a spotless bathroom. I unpacked quickly and settled in for the night. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a sound that sent a chill down my spine. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway outside the studio. At first, I thought it might be Sarah or her husband. Maybe they needed something from the shared storage area. But the footsteps stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, straining to listen. Minutes passed and then retreated, fading into the distance. The next morning, I mentioned it to Sarah casually. She seemed surprised, but brushed it off. "It's just us here," she said with a small laugh. "Maybe it was the pipes or something." That night, I made sure to lock the door and double-check the windows. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, heavier. My pulse quickened as they stopped again outside my door. I grabbed my phone and crept to the door, peering through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Gathering my courage, I unlocked the door and swung it open. Nothing. But then, from the far end of the hall, I heard the faint click of a door shutting. The next morning, I demanded answers from Sarah. She seemed shaken, but insisted that no one else had access to the property. Still, she agreed to investigate. Later that day, she called me. Her voice was shaky. "We found a crawl space behind the closet in the hallway," she said. There were blankets and food wrappers. Someone had been living there, watching. I left immediately. Weeks later, I learned from Sarah that the intruder had been sneaking into the studio through the crawl space, watching me while I slept.